Welcome to Markets Plus, where leading experts from across BMO discuss factors shaping the markets, economy, industry sectors, and much more. Visit bmocm.com/Markets Plus for more episodes. The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of BMO Capital Markets, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Welcome to this special episode of Markets Plus podcast, where we'll dive into the implications of Canada's federal election. I'm Camilla Sutton, Head of Equity Research, Canada and the UK at BMO Capital Markets. Today, I have the pleasure to host two strong Canadians with extensive provincial and federal experience. The Honourable Brian Tobin, Vice Chair, BMO Financial Group, former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, and Federal Cabinet Minister. Known for his leadership as Minister of Fisheries, he later served as Premier from 1996 to 2000, focusing on economic growth and resource development. Welcome, Brian.
Delighted to be here. You're a brave soul to take on these two characters, but good luck.
We also have the Honourable Jason Kenney, Senior Advisor, BMO Financial Group, former Premier of Alberta and longtime Federal Cabinet Minister. He served as a Member of Parliament for nearly 20 years, holding key roles including Minister of Immigration and of Defence, and led the province as Premier from 2019 to 2022. Welcome, Jason.
Great to be here.
Thank you both for joining us. Brian, why don't we get started with you? Looking at the results of the federal election, what stands out most to you, and what do you think this means for Canada's direction over the next few years?
Well, it's quite an extraordinary election. Both Jason and I spent 20 plus years in politics. And over that period of time, in particular in national politics, there was always a divide in the Parliament of Canada that reflected not just the traditional parties, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, but also the NDP. Way back when I first got elected, there were still the traces of the So-Cred Party. That was 45 years ago. And now, the Reform Party came along and divided the Conservative movement for a period of time, et cetera. In this election, 85% of the voting public voted for either the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party. That is extraordinary regrouping of the electoral opinion of the people of Canada around two parties. So an extraordinary event. Clearly, it needs to be said, when we look at the election from the vantage point of the polls the week before, we say, well, it was a bit of a miss in that the Liberals didn't get a majority. But if you look at the election from the vantage point of 6 or 7 weeks before, it was an extraordinary, in fact, I would argue, the biggest turnaround in the history of Canada electorally. To have Mr. Carney end up 3 seats shy of a majority government was quite an extraordinary result. So I'm delighted. I happen to spend a big chunk of my time in the Liberal Party of old, and I'm delighted to see a centrist, I would say even slightly center-right Liberal Prime Minister back in office in Canada. I think he's what we need at a very challenging time for Canada.
Jason, what about you? What stands out most to you, and what do you think it means for Canada's direction over the next few years?
Trump stands out most to me. For our American listeners, what Brian's referring to in terms of the turnaround is that the Conservative Party, led by my former intern, my former executive assistant, Pierre Poilievre, originally from Calgary and more recently from Ottawa, he was leading in the polls with, on average, a 25 percentage point lead for the better part of 18 months, partly because of Mr. Trudeau, after a decade, had become deeply unpopular. There are a number of underlying reasons for that: an affordability, cost of living crisis. Most particularly, housing prices have doubled in a decade, and younger people are generally completely priced out of the dream of home ownership. Increasing crime and social disorder in our biggest cities connected to an addictions crisis that many people felt Mr. Trudeau's government had exacerbated, and a lot of other in more general terms, we've seen a steep decline in our national productivity, per capita gross domestic product, a flight of investment capital, a lot of big problems being felt by real people. And so they wanted change. Mr. Poilievre is very dynamic, aggressive, effective communicator, has been perhaps the most effective opposition leader, if not in the post-war period, certainly our lifetime. He took that opportunity of deep frustration, put the focus on Mr. Trudeau and certain signature Trudeau Liberal policies like the retail carbon tax, and really drove the agenda. But then Donald Trump arrives on the scene last November for his second appearance in the White House, and almost immediately, in a way that none of us predicted, starts to focus on Canada as a apparent adversary. We thought we'd be trying to appeal for an exemption for the expected 10% global tariff. Instead, starting about 3 weeks after his election victory, he announces Canada and Mexico will face discriminatory 25% tariffs on everything on national security grounds. Now, we understand that the U.S. southern border, everybody understands, has real security issues. But the northern border with Canada, there are issues, but they are a tiny fraction of what they are with Mexico, and yet we were brought into the same national security frame. Justin Trudeau flies down to Mar-a-Lago, entreats the president-elect to get back to the USMCA that they negotiated in 2019. And then Trump says in that dinner, well, listen, if you can't afford my tariffs, maybe you should just become the 51st state. What starts as a joke then turns into a theme. Then he starts talking about the illegitimacy of the borders, and we're going to use economic pressure to annex Canada. You know, one thing our American listeners need to understand, there is a historic anxiety about living next to the superpower that goes all the way back to the beginning of our history. And Mr. Trump re-energized that anxiety. Voters wanted safety, security, and they turned to a man, Mr. Kenney, who looked like that. The Trump pressure forced his own caucus to remove Mr. Trudeau as leader. Mr. Kenney steps in, looks like a safe pair of hands, mature, experienced, remarkable CV. And by comparison, suddenly Mr. Poilievre started to look like an overly aggressive opposition leader who had not really auditioned to be prime minister. So that was kind of the dynamic, and you end up, as Brian says, with a total reversal of the results that all of us, including, I think, just about every Liberal, was expecting a couple of months ago.
No question. Look, I think that Jason gives a very important explanation, in particular to people who are listening to this podcast and live in the U.S. and wondering what the devil just happened in Canada. But pay attention to what's happening in the UK. Pay attention to what's happening in Australia, because there, Mr. Starmer, who was in serious trouble in a very short order after his re-election, is now suddenly doing much better in the polls. And he's doing much better in the polls in the UK for the same reason Canadians became alarmed at some of the talk that was coming from Mr. Trump's White House, and Mr. Trump in particular, over the last period of time. Look at Australia. Yeah. Mr. Albanese, who was also not expected to get reelected, is now competitive again, may get reelected again. He's been speaking on behalf of Australians quite strongly in response to some of the stronger words from Mr. Trump and some of the threats from Mr. Trump to tariff a good ally like Australia, or for that matter, the UK, or as Jason points out, a best friend like Canada. So we shouldn't underestimate the Trump effect in the campaign. I don't, but we should acknowledge, and Jason just has, and I appreciate that, it took an extraordinary person suited to the time and the challenge to take advantage of the Trump effect. And that person was Mark Carney.
So where do we go from here then? If you're prime minister today, what would you advise in terms of how does he look at the U.S.? How does he rebuild that relationship? How does he balance between being firm as well as protecting the economy?
Well, I would say there's sort of two themes here. One, how do you deal directly with Trump? And then how do you reform the Canadian economy to be more resilient and less dependent on the United States? Those were the two themes throughout this election. On the former, there was barely any daylight between the Conservatives and Liberals, between Poilievre and Kenney. They both agreed that there should be reciprocal dollar-for-dollar tariffs that are calibrated in a way that maximizes pressure on targeted U.S. regions and industries and minimizes pressure on the Canadian economy. By the way, none of us one thing that's come out of this is that there was a ferocious debate in this country 30 years ago about free trade. That no longer exists. We even have the party of the left in Canada, the NDP, opposed to tariffs and in favor of free trade. So I'll take that as a silver lining on the cloud of Trump's protectionism. But the idea of reciprocal tariffs it's a proxy for responding to his aggression with strength. I think there's a consensus here that Mr. Kenney represents, in part, that you don't respond to those kinds of aggressive tactics by weakness. So responding with strength is point one. Then the real debate here, and where Mr. Kenney's big challenge is going to be, how do we turn around a fairly significant secular decline in Canadian productivity, competitiveness, outflow of investment, and a huge over-reliance on the United States export market. 80% of our exports go there. I was part of a federal government, a Harper government, that negotiated and signed 39 additional free trade agreements around the world. We went from 5 to 44 free trade agreements, partly through all of Europe on CETA, Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership. We did it intentionally to reduce our overdependence on the American export market. But guess what? A decade later, we are actually more dependent on the Americans. Why? My premise is that we frankly do not produce at scale the kind of value-added manufactured products that are competitive that the rest of the world wants to buy. What we have in abundance, from Brian's province in Newfoundland to the West Coast, what we have is resources and commodities. And so the challenge for Mr. Carney, who has a very strong environmental commitment, is how do we better develop and get to market, build the infrastructure, and clean up our regulatory morass so that we can get those commodities, energy, resources to global markets.
And let me just jump in and say there's no inherent conflict. And this has been, to me, the debate that has occupied us. There's no inherent conflict between being committed to using our resources to our advantage to create wealth in this country, to create jobs in this country, and being concerned about our environment. The assumption that if you're pro-mining or you're pro-energy development, therefore you are anti-environment, is a false argument. You can be both. And Mark Carney is both concerned about the environment, as are most Canadians and most people in public life, and realizing that if Canada is going to stand up to the kind of noise we're hearing from Mr. Trump, we have to be strong economically as well as politically. Sovereignty is not just an expression, a word. It has to be a fact. You have to be in strong shape economically. So what does he do with Mr. Trump? I think first speak calmly, quietly, but plain language. And what he said, which is rather strong, is that the relationship as we've known it is over. That's a pretty strong declaration. Now, I would say to you as a Canadian business person, there's never going to be a better market for Canada than the United States. The United States is always going to be our best market. This is a transitory period we're going through. I'm sure that on the other side of this period, we will once again be each other's best friends. I believe that. However, good fences make good friends. And what Mark Carney's doing is laying down a fence, in a sense, that says, you can't come here. You can't take our resources. You can't impinge upon our sovereignty. We will trade with you as equals. We will trade with you as equally sovereign nations. And by the way, we're going to go out and explore very aggressively how we trade more effectively, as Jason just pointed out, 39 new agreements during the Harper years with the rest of the world. That's incredibly important. But I don't kid myself that somehow Canada is going to make all of the value of the Canada-U.S. relationship go away and replace it with other relationships. That is an aspiration. That's not a reality. But it's going to take, tough, clear, direct leadership. My own belief is Mr. Trump already knows the trade war, the tariff war that he started with the whole world, not just with Canada, is already lost. And he's going to be looking for a way to declare victory, whether victory is real or not, and then retreat. And we need to be strong in order to enhance that day, to make sure that day comes soon.
Let's pivot to energy. We talked about it briefly already, but Prime Minister Carney really campaigned across the idea of Canada as an energy superpower. From your perspective, how realistic is the vision? What would it take? Brian, why don't you kick us off with that?
No, I think there's no question Canada is an energy superpower. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of energy today. As Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm the guy that negotiated and completed the negotiations on the Hibernia Agreement. I did White Rose. I did Terra Nova. We rolled in, $25 billion worth of new investment in a relatively short period of time by having clear rules, by creating the circumstances where capital knew it could be put to work, where capital knew there'd be simple payback in a reasonable period of time. And we saw tremendous contribution to the Newfoundland and Labrador's economy, the East Coast economy of Canada, by allowing that to happen. The same is true for Alberta. I mean, look, when you hear from Alberta, I get it. Many of the people who work in Alberta come from Newfoundland and Labrador, come from other parts of Canada. When people say, hey, let's not talk in a cavalier fashion about the importance of the contribution of the oil and gas industry in Alberta, or for that matter in Saskatchewan, or for that matter in British Columbia when it comes to natural gas, we ought to listen very carefully. And so when I hear Mark Carney say, as somebody who's got environmental credentials, that he wants with both sustainable energy And with conventional energy, Canada to be an energy superpower, that's a pretty powerful signal that we're going to remain open for business and we're going to move our resources not just down to the U.S. as we've always done, but we're going to look for other markets. That's important.
The comment or the phrase Canada as an energy superpower, the interesting thing is this was a phrase first coined, used by Prime Minister Harper speaking to the Canada United Kingdom Chamber of Commerce in July of 2006. I remember I was there and it created contentious headlines. I don't know why they were contentious. But Brian's right. We are. It's a statement of fact. We are the fourth largest oil producer on Earth with the third largest proven and probable oil reserves, 172 billion barrels of it. The fifth largest natural gas reserves in the world, 12 trillion cubic feet of natural gas that's proven and probable. And the other forms of energy, we have the second largest uranium reserves on Earth, almost completely in Saskatchewan.
And don't forget our tremendous hydro.
85% of our electricity grid is
British Columbia,
has zero
Manitoba,
emissions because of
Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador,
and Central Canadian Nuclear, or Ontario and New Brunswick.
My God, we sound like we're from the same party, and we know that's not true.
The challenge has always been for us getting all the hydrocarbon energy, in particular, to global markets. And some positive news has been last year the commissioning of the Trans Mountain expansion, which adds 500,000 barrels a day of egress.
Let me just ask my friend to pause. Built by a Liberal government at a cost in excess of $30 billion and added $8 a barrel to every barrel of crude being exported to the United States. A huge advantage for the people of Alberta. Long overdue and well done. Sorry, Jason, carry on.
Well, I was going to get there, but since you've raised it, you might want to take some responsibility on your side of the aisle for having created the regulatory morass that caused Kinder Morgan to drop the project. But we're all happily
we're not going to go there. We're going for a drink afterwards. We don't want to ruin that. Go ahead, but carry on.
The point is, I do hope coming out of this election that there does appear to be something like a new cross-partisan consensus forming around the imperative of developing those resources in a responsible way, increasing their shipment to global markets. That means two things primarily: liquefied natural gas, and I hope additional crude shipments on global markets. Now, to people with green concerns, which I share, I would remind them that you could shut down the Canadian oil and gas today and it would not affect global demand by 1 barrel or 1 cubic foot. It would simply shift that capital and that production to jurisdictions who generally have lower environmental, human rights, and labor standards. I don't think that's good for the world. It's not good for the environment. The single biggest way that Canada could reduce global GHG emissions, and Mr. Carney knows very well, that the climate change challenge is not a domestic, it's not sealed within the borders of Canada, it is a global emissions challenge, would be to get major LNG exports off our coasts. After 20 years of trying, this year we will finally commission LNG Canada, big project led by Shell on the West Coast. We hope they'll go forward with phase 2 of that. There are 2 smaller LNG projects on the West Coast. I hope Mr. Carney will sit down with those industry, First Nations, and provincial and labor union leaders to say, how do we get Shell Canada or LNG Canada to phase 2? How do we get this big Rockies project, which would be similar scale? And how do we get East Coast LNG done as well? I'll tell you a story. In 2008, I met Narendra Modi, the now Prime Minister of India, when he was the Premier of the state of Gujarat. He was just opening a LNG import terminal in his state. He said to me, how quickly can we get your Canadian LNG? Because he said, I'm importing it from Qatar. And they use that energy money to fund the Taliban, which then projects terrorism into India, which, by the way, just happened last week. And he said, we want to buy it from our friends and allies. Well, we haven't moved a molecule of LNG onto a global market since then. We're about to. I think Mr. Carney sees both the commercial and the climate benefit. Let's put the pedal to the gas on that.
I agree with what you've just said, the observations you've made, but I want to reiterate again, we can do these things. We can do them well. When we did a fixed platform, Hibernia, in the East Coast, off Newfoundland, 320 kilometers offshore, we didn't build a thing with the thought of putting the fisheries at risk. We built a thing that could withstand 1 million metric ton hit were it to happen by an iceberg. But we planned for that too, because we started tracking the icebergs hundreds of miles to the north. And we actually have the capacity, if capacity were needed, to actually move those icebergs and move their directions as they start their long journey down south. With respect to the floating platforms, we literally have the ability to pull those things off days before an iceberg might come near them. We actually haven't had to do that, and move those out of the way of traffic. So the technology, the know-how that can put a man on the moon allows us to manage important matters, like the movement of icebergs off the east coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. The other thing, and Jason, you mentioned it briefly, there is tremendous reserves of gas off the east coast as well. So all of that gas today, much of it being used to manage reservoirs on the east coast off Newfoundland, that's all available. Off Labrador, we don't even know how much gas is available there, but it's there. And as the climate warms up, the ability to get access to it and to develop it safely and responsibly is also there. And one other pitch I have to drop for all of our ears. We have 5,000 megawatts of low-cost, high-quality, beautiful hydro within Labrador, there to be developed, subject to finalizing an agreement between Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec. I mean, so when we talk about being a superpower, we don't just mean oil and gas, though we should, properly developed. There are other sources of power as well.
East Coast LNG, the Repsol, the Spanish company, owns an LNG import terminal in the Bay of Fundy off the St. John. With real intent, that could be turned into an export liquefaction facility quickly. Energy Saguenay was a project to create a large LNG facility in the North Shore of the St. Lawrence in Quebec. François Legault came to me as premier and said, could you help to capitalize this? We think it's a great project. And we looked at that. I actually introduced the project to Warren Buffett and to Greg Abel at Berkshire Hathaway, and they were about to come in with serious investment, but started to get cold feet when Quebec showed it was uncertain about the regulatory environment. Since then, Mr. Legault banned natural gas. I think he's willing to reconsider it. I would highly commend that for the province of Quebec. But Mr. Carney is going to have to get serious. These can't just be aspirations anymore. Serious about cutting back the regulatory morass that's holding back these projects. First Nations are increasingly enthusiastic partners, equity partners in projects like this. We need provinces like the government of BC to be clearly pro-LNG. There have been some challenges there. If we can get all of those things lined up, and this is an opportunity for strong national leadership, we'll be reducing global emissions and generating tens of billions of dollars of value, tax revenues, a stronger Canada, a more resilient Canada to deal with any protectionist threats that we face.
Jason, you've opened the door for us to pivot to the provincial side here. As both of you former premiers, how do you interpret the results from a provincial lens in terms of the provincial-federal relationship, especially given some growing tensions we're seeing with trade, with sovereignty, with economic? Jason, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, one of the biggest deadweight costs in the Canadian economy is the barriers to internal trade and mobility and the lack of regulatory harmonization. Now, I just put most people to sleep. I'll tell you, one of the reasons these have never been action items for governments is because, when Brian and I were knocking on doors and people like us in this campaign just a few days ago, no one ever said to a politician at the door, how much progress are you making on interprovincial regulatory harmonization? This is a sleeper issue, but a very important one. Enough is enough. Canada was created in 1867 primarily to be an economic union. And I believe the government of Canada, and I say this as the former Premier of Alberta, we are like Quebec, we are the great guardians of provincial powers. But I said to Justin Trudeau, and I would say to Prime Minister Carney, you have constitutional superpowers to create the economic union. And if the provinces will not play ball, if they will not, of their own volition, strike down interprovincial trade barriers, procurement preferences, rigidity in labor market mobility, unacceptable regulatory disalignment, you need to step in. Now, he apparently has an agreement in principle to do that by July the 1st. I'm a little skeptical. I've been around these tables negotiating with other provinces. But most of the studies indicate we could generate an increase of about $100 billion in Canada's GDP if we got this right. So I hope there will be significant and fast progress on internal trade.
Let me just pick up on what Jason has said. This is unquestionably a critically important matter. I'm actually optimistic that the moment that we're in challenges us to meet the opportunity we've been given by Mr. Trump, suggesting that Canada would somehow be better as a state. And it's a wake-up call. And that premiers will understand, and Canadians understand, there are some things bigger than our own backyards and our own preferences. And one of those is Canada. So I find it extraordinary, for example, in the province of Quebec, you've seen a vote for the Federalist parties, which is quite substantial. I won't even get into the seat count. Obviously, a very healthy one for Mr. Carney. But if you combine the Liberal vote,
the bloc is down to like 20 seats, right?
They're down to 20 seats, and they're down to 20-odd% of the vote. And so you're seeing a very substantial vote, in effect, for protecting continuing Canada. Vote for Federalist parties. That's worth observing. What does that tell you? It tells you that on any given day, normally we could find reasons to reflect on our differences within Canada. This campaign has caused us all to think very hard. As I said at the very beginning, 85% of the people of Canada voted for the two big parties. Haven't seen that in 70 or 80 years. Why? Because people are concerned about the actual fundamental future of the country. I think we'll solve, Jason, perhaps not perfectly, but I think we'll solve in many respects and eliminate many of the barriers that have existed between the provinces. But here's the issue that I want to raise, and I raise it hopefully. There are some stresses and strains in the Federation. Notably, we've heard a lot of noise out of the province of Alberta in particular and the Premier of Alberta. But I've also heard the comments of the Premier of Saskatchewan, Premier Moe, who came out and, has just as strong a conservative base as Alberta, perhaps stronger.
Actually, it is now, yeah.
In some sense. And Premier Moe was quick to say, hey, the election's over. People have voted. I want to congratulate the guy who won. I'm not leading the charge here in Saskatchewan for anything other than the unity of the country. We're Canadians. We're going to make Canada work. That's exactly the right kind of leadership to express in the face of what could be a fractious result. I want to see more of that, hopefully, coming from the province of Alberta. And at the same time, I want to see more of that coming, given the results of the election in Quebec. I want to see Quebec open to seeing the passage of Alberta crude through Quebec on its way to the refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. Canada has an opportunity to stand a foot taller for sure in the international arena, but we're only going to do it if we stop pulling apart and we start pulling together.
Brian, Jason, thank you both for your insights and candor. It's been a privilege to hear your perspectives on the election in Canada. That was Brian Tobin and Jason Kenney, who joined us today, April 30th, to share their perspective on the recent Canadian election outcomes. At BMO, we're proud to deliver thoughtful analysis that supports informed investment decisions. If you enjoyed today's Market Plus podcast, please do subscribe and rate it.
Thanks for listening. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, visit bmocm.com/marketsplus.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.